Hollywood's sharpest lawyer is back. Ben Chew targets Diddy's system. It wasn't the courtroom that first caught Ben Chew's attention. It was the silence. The kind of quiet that doesn't signal peace but suppression. It lingered in the air like humidity-dense and intentional muffling tension that should have cracked wide open. Chew had seen it before. In high-profile trials, silence could be louder than outrage, and this courtroom had plenty of both. He hadn't planned to follow the Diddy case closely. His name was now attached to victory after victory, especially following Johnny Depp's explosive defamation trial. He had done his part, proved a point, restored an image. But this one felt different, not because of the fame, but because of the pattern. Because systems that protect predators always look the same, whether in Hollywood, Washington, or hip-hop. Chew arrived in court that morning, as a guest, not a participant. A legal observer, sure, but also someone looking for answers only the shadows could provide. He wasn't interested in gossip. He was interested in leverage, in architecture, in the mechanisms that allowed a name like Sean Diddy Combs to operate unchecked for decades. The judge called recess, just as Chew stepped in. But that was fine. He didn't need to hear testimony. The evidence was everywhere in how the bailiff avoided eye contact with the first row, how the journalists typed quietly instead of posting clips, how the defense team moved like they were out of rhythm with their own performance. Something cracked, Chew muttered under his breath. A clerk passed by, dropped a file. It wasn't his. He picked it up anyway. Inside, a copy of a receipt. Hotel minibar, $980. 3 bottles of massage oil. One unlisted item marked only as discretion. It meant nothing and everything. He read through the redacted name at the top, Jane Doe. He'd read about her. Not much in the media, but in legal circles she was a cipher. She had testified. Soft voice, hard facts. Said she never meant to bring him down, only to stop herself from going under. Chew remembered that phrase. I didn't come to punish him. I came so I didn't disappear. That's when he knew this wasn't about a single man. It was about a machine. He took a seat in the back row, just as the next witness was called, David James. Chew leaned forward. The man who had worked under Diddy for more than a decade walked to the stand with the caution of someone who had once confused loyalty with silence. He looked clean, sober, ready, and broken in ways that weren't visible. The prosecutor approached. Mr. James, can you walk us through the travel protocol? James nodded. Every trip we carried the same items. Cash, condoms, 3 sets of oils, 1 playlist, a burner phone, sometimes 2. Chew blinked. A playlist, he whispered, almost amused. The prosecutor followed up. What was the purpose of the burner phones? For contacting girls, no names, just codes. Sometimes they were already in the city, sometimes we flew them in. The goal was no trace, the room didn't move, and where would they go? Studio B. Chew had seen the name scrawled on a pad by one of the journalists. Studio B, a place, a protocol, an accusation disguised as architecture. Describe Studio B. James hesitated. There was a chair, 1 mirror, a locked cabinet, and the speaker system. Was it for music? Yes, but not the kind that plays to entertain. It looped. White noise, bass lines, drone tones. It set the mood, or erased it. Chew scribbled something in his notes. Sound design to numb awareness. The prosecutor shifted. What else happened in Studio B? James's jaw tensed. I wasn't supposed to watch, but I was supposed to clean. A pause. Did you clean anything specific? James swallowed. Mirrors, headphones, handles. Once a used contract, not signed. But there were initials. Do you remember them? He nodded. J.D. Jane Doe. James didn't answer. He didn't have to. Chew closed his notebook. This wasn't a defense. This wasn't even just a trial. It was a structure collapsing in real time. And as much as people wanted to believe it was about sex, fame, money, it was really about pattern recognition, about how much harm people could normalize, as long as they called it success. Outside protesters had begun to gather. One held a sign that said, "Music shouldn't hurt." Another had printed, "Ask about the locked room," but Chu kept watching the jury. Most of them looked tired. One wiped away a tear. Another sat back with arms crossed. Ben Chu knew from experience that no courtroom was ever about just one voice. Trials were symphonies of half-truths, orchestrated silence and buried memory. And on this morning, the next movement of the piece began not with a statement, but a whisper, a ripple that started in the gallery and ended at the prosecution bench. A new witness had agreed to testify, not on record, not on camera, but live with identity shielded, her condition, that the doors remain closed and no media be allowed inside. The judge granted it. The gallery emptied. Even Chu, now recognized by reporters, was ushered outside. But he didn't leave. He waited in the hallway near a court officer who'd worked a major celebrity case and now walked with a limp. "She's one of them," the officer muttered. Chu didn't ask who. He already knew. Inside, they called her Mia. Not her real name, maybe not even her middle one, but it was the name printed on the flight manifest on the temporary ID tucked into her purse and on the envelope that contained $200 in petty cash with a note that said, "Smile when asked." It was the name whispered to the driver waiting outside Terminal C. It was the name she was told to respond to, firmly, sweetly, and without asking questions. They told her not to bring luggage, said everything she needed would be provided. When she asked if she'd get it back, her real phone, her clothes, someone smiled and said, "Only if you make a good impression." Her phone was replaced with one preloaded with 5 contacts. One number was labeled driver, another manager, and the rest were just initials. But only one number worked the assistant. The voice on the other end was always calm, always scripted. She remembered her arrival as if it happened through frosted glass. At the airport, a man she didn't recognize handed her champagne before she even sat down in the car. To celebrate, he said with a grin, celebrate what she wanted to ask. But she didn't. She just smiled. The way girls are taught to, when the room is too quiet, too cold, or filled with power they can't name. The drive was long, coastal roads, private gates, the kind of scenery meant to disarm. Once there, she wasn't greeted. She was processed. One woman checked her nails, another took her measurements. Someone else handed her a set of loungewear and said, "You'll change before dinner." But there was no dinner, just music. Constant low-frequency sound bleeding from hidden speakers. She passed rooms with names like the Sweet Candle Room and Basement Lounge. Each had a scent, vanilla, citrus, lavender, all artificial. Studio B wasn't on any tour. It wasn't spoken of. It simply existed like a shadow cast by a room with no light. You didn't enter Studio B unless summoned. And once you were inside, nothing resembled normal. There were no soft couches, no flowers, just a chair, a mirror, and an echo. Was there a camera, the prosecutor asked? Mia looked up, not visibly, but you could feel it. Like a lens in the walls, the mirror wasn't a mirror. It was too clean. It didn't fog. Chu, still in the hallway, heard nothing. But he knew enough to imagine the tension. The moment when the jury, already heavy with James's facts, began to see the emotional map behind them. Mia continued. She talked about the playlist, the contracts, the way they were told to sign even if they didn't read. "It's just for media releases," someone told her, "just in case you're seen." "But what if I say no?" she had asked once. "You won't," was the answer. She didn't. She said she left after 6 days. Or maybe 10. She wasn't sure. Because time bent in that house. Days bled into each other like drinks at a too-dark club. But when she finally left, she knew she hadn't escaped. She had been released. And 2 years later, she was scrolling through a blog that had gained traction for exposing celebrity NDAs when she froze. A photo blurry cropped, but unmistakably hers. Her signature, dated, positioned beneath a clause she didn't recognize. It was a document labeled as a consent form, not the kind she remembered casually skimming. This one referenced distribution rights waivers of liability and a clause that implied she had agreed to exclusive access use. Her hands shook as she enlarged the image. Her name in her own handwriting, but she had no memory of signing it. The document had been leaked with dozens of others, anonymous. Part of a database someone had stolen, or maybe someone had finally decided to leak. She stared at the lines again and again, waiting for a memory to surface that never did. That's when she knew something deeper had been taken. She tried calling one of the numbers from that old burner phone. Disconnected. Then she called the friend who'd driven her home that final day. He didn't answer. She left a voicemail. I think something happened to me. And I think it's still happening. The next week, a mutual friend introduced her to someone who had ties to a legal advocacy group for people affected by manipulation and control. That person didn't blink when she shared her story. Instead, they asked one question. Do you want someone who's been through hell, or someone who's seen it from the inside? She didn't hesitate. I want both. They gave her Ben Chu's name, not directly, but through a thread of quiet connections, through people who had seen what he'd done during the Depp trial, who'd whispered afterward that he was the rare kind of lawyer who didn't flinch when the stories got grotesque, or worse, unbelievable. Now, Chu stood in the hallway outside courtroom 6C, listening not with his ears, but with the part of him trained to find pattern in chaos. He could tell from the pacing of the guards, from the way court staff exchanged glances, that what was happening inside wasn't routine. It wasn't just a person recounting harm. It was the unmasking of design. This wasn't merely coercion, this was choreography. He could predict the rhythm now. The witnesses didn't describe isolated incidents, they described procedures. Each girl recalled the same setting, the same playlist humming just beneath perception, the same 3 questions always asked with the same disarming tone. Do you drink? Do you like candles? Have you been here before? He took out his phone and opened his note app. He typed standardized grooming patterns, rehearsed language, worse cult programming. Then he added participants rotated, environment static, language reused, consent assumed never clarified. He didn't need to see the next exhibit. He already knew what it would be. The prosecution would present the receipts. They would start stacking paper credit card charges to holding companies' accommodations, billed through shell corporations, wire transfers to assistants marked as Miss-Key Guest Services. Then they would show the text messages, names redacted, numbers replaced by case IDs. But the content would speak. Logistics cloaked in euphemism, 3 sets of oils, 2 chilled, 1 warm. No tap water. Green light confirmed. Guest beta on site. He could hear the courtroom go still. He could picture the gallery leaning forward. And still he stood in the hallway, watching the shadows shift behind the frosted glass. This wasn't about proving harm. This was about exposing a system built to erase it. And then they'd turn to Jane. Jane Doe had testified already, but her voice was still echoing. Her journal submitted as evidence contained entries that lined up perfectly with timestamps from Mia's testimony. Same nights, same rooms, different women, same ritual. In one entry, Jane wrote, "He smiled when I flinched, said it made me look innocent." In another, there's a hallway in the basement with no lights, just doors. Some stay locked. Chu read those in a private briefing. Now they were being read aloud. And then the bombshell. The prosecution revealed a set of internal messages recovered from a decrypted server. They weren't explicit, but they contained logistics. Studio B prepare candles, playlist B3 no tap water. Guest arrives at 2:05. Contract pending, use ambiance script. JD won't be present. Green light. The court stilled. In the hallway, Chu whispered to himself they logged it. Like it was routine, like it was catering. He didn't need to hear more. He stepped away from the wall and headed toward the back exit. Ben Chu didn't leave the courthouse that afternoon. He didn't need to be inside the courtroom anymore to understand what was unfolding. It was all there in the notes, in the silence, in the repetition. The machine wasn't subtle. It didn't try to hide what it did. It disguised itself through banality, familiar patterns, sanitized logistics, forms, receipts, aliases. It didn't threaten people, it processed them. He found a bench near the lobby, took out his laptop, and began organizing his notes. Not by person, by pattern. Every mention of Studio B, every coded message, every timestamp that lined up with journal entries from Jane or recollections from Mia. And slowly a map began to form. A digital overlay of routes, taken suites, booked playlists, triggered, and orders placed. There were patterns in the scent, preferences, lavender, citrus, sandalwood. In the requests, no photographs, heavy curtains, candles placed near floor vents. There were even instructions for sound levels, some marked with color codes. Blue, calm loop. Red, room silence, plus 20 dB baseline. Chu paused, then typed a heading, behavioral conditioning via environment. He had seen this before. Not in entertainment law. In testimony from former cult deprogrammers. From whistleblowers inside correctional behavior centers. It wasn't illegal on the surface, but it was unmistakably manipulative. Back upstairs, the next witness approached the stand with the hesitant shuffle of someone who didn't want to be seen, but knew he had to be heard. He looked young, maybe mid-20s, and though he wore a suit, it didn't quite fit right. The sleeves were too long, or maybe his posture was just too small. His name wasn't disclosed. The court referred to him only as T. Another assistant more junior than James, less practiced, but with a face that looked like it had aged years and weeks. The prosecutor asked him to speak about his onboarding. T took a shaky breath and started from the beginning. There was a tablet, he said. It played a video, 10 minutes long, voiceover, corporate sounding. Kinda like training for a hotel, except we weren't really running a hotel. He paused, then added, we signed NDAs after that. Then came the list. What list? Operational standards, he said. They called them that. It was printed on laminated paper. There were rules. Like, do not speak unless spoken to. Do not ask about guests. Do not document activity unless instructed. Simple language, but specific. The prosecutor nodded. Did you follow those rules? T looked down, not all of them. A murmur passed through the room. T looked back up, his voice steadied. I kept a logbook, he said. I didn't mean to at first, but after a while I just needed to keep track. I needed to remember what I saw, because people would act like nothing happened. Guests would come in happy and leave quiet, or shaken, or worse. And the staff, they'd say things like, she'll be fine tomorrow, or don't get involved. So the logbook was for yourself. Yes. I hid it in my car. Folded inside a to-go menu under the seat. Wrote with pencil so it wouldn't bleed. I didn't name anyone, just dates, descriptions, enough to remind myself I wasn't imagining it. He swallowed. Because Studio B, it wasn't just a room. It was a pattern, a cycle. It had a rhythm. He read aloud an entry dated July 18th. Guest arrived in gray hoodie. Refused champagne. 2 assistants escorted her to prep room. Returned 47 minutes later, eyes red, unsteady walk. Playlist B3 still looping. Studio B unoccupied for next 6 hours. Chu's fingers hovered over the keyboard. This wasn't testimony. This was forensic memory. Back in his bench, Chu cross-referenced the date, July 18th. Jane's journal had an entry today someone else wore the robe. I recognized the fear. I saw myself 2 months ago. I smiled at her. She didn't smile back. Different voices. Same timeline. Parallel perception. And suddenly the evidence wasn't just aligned. It was overlapping, overwhelming. The assistant continued. Sometimes he wouldn't show up. just left instructions. But the girls didn't know that. They were prepared anyway. Same music, same drink, same camera blinking in the corner. Was it always the same script, the prosecutor asked? Almost word for word, the assistant said. We had templates. Templates, yeah, like menus, ambiance options, everything from scent to sentence structure. I think they thought it made the girls feel like it was luxury, was it? The assistant didn't answer right away. Then softly, it was theater, for everyone but them. The court went quiet. Chu sat back. His notes now filled 3 files. One marked logistics, one testimony, one atmosphere. But the real story, he knew, was the intersection of those 3, where instructions became reality, where routine concealed trauma. Then came the next layer, digital forensics. A tech analyst presented metadata, timestamp overlays, location pings, deleted messages recovered from cloud backups. Nothing criminal on its own, but chilling in accumulation. Why was there a playlist titled Compliance? The analyst was asked. I don't know, she said, but it was used repeatedly in the Studio B speaker logs, always for sessions longer than 30 minutes. Did it contain lyrics? No. It was mostly tone frequencies, pulses, binaural patterns. Chu knew what that meant. Conditioning, not necessarily mind control, but disassociation, sensory recalibration, the sound equivalent of a fog machine. This wasn't indulgence, this was infrastructure, and now it was collapsing in public. The morning after the tech analyst's presentation, the courtroom felt different, like it was slowly shifting from a place of law to a place of reckoning. Reporters showed up earlier than usual. Some had traded their suits for sneakers ready for the long day. The buzz was electric, not just curiosity, but urgency, as if they all knew something irreversible had started. Ben Chu arrived quietly as always, black coffee in one hand and a worn leather folder in the other. He didn't go to the bench or talk to the press. He just sat, opened his folder, and reviewed the printouts from the metadata exhibit. The patterns weren't just consistent, they were obsessive. Repetition meant intent, and intent meant planning. The prosecution began the day with a surprising move, not another witness, but a chart. It filled an entire easel, columns of dates, rows of initials, timestamps, coded phrases, and red dots. No names, just sequences. But for anyone paying attention, the message was clear. There was a design. A junior prosecutor stepped forward. She was young but poised, and when she spoke, the room leaned in. This is not about isolated incidents, she said. This is about repetition, about environment, about a structure that operated not in the shadows, but in silence. She walked the jury through the chart. 1 week in June, 3 guests. Each had nearly identical arrival times, identical music sequences, identical concierge notes, prepared with playlist B2, provided signature robe, studio lights set to amber. Then she dropped the phrase that would echo through the rest of the day. This was not random. This was a routine. Ben Chu wrote it down slowly, then underlined it twice. He paused with his pen resting on the paper, staring at the ink like he was letting it settle not just onto the page, but into the room. It wasn't just a line of argument, it was the skeleton key, the phrase that unlocked everything. The next witness stepped into place with a kind of stiff awkwardness, like someone who had worn uniforms for most of his life, but wasn't used to sitting still. A private contractor, hired under a neutral-sounding job title, event support specialist. But there was nothing neutral about his presence. He adjusted his collar, which seemed tighter than it should have been, and looked around as if expecting someone to stop him before he spoke. No one did. The prosecutor began with gentle questions just to guide him into rhythm. Were you ever instructed to remove phones from guests? Yes. His voice was clipped, not defensive, not nervous, just factual. Did anyone explain why? No. Not directly. It was part of the intake process. And what was your understanding of that process? They arrive. They're welcomed. Their bags are taken. Phones get handed over at the door. If someone asked why, we were told to say it was for their privacy, that this was a media-free zone. Did everyone comply? Most did. A few didn't. They were either turned away or he trailed off, or what he blinked slowly, or they didn't come back. The prosecutor let the silence hang. Did that seem normal to you? At first, the contractor shifted in his seat. I thought it was a VIP thing, big names, discretion. I'd worked security for clubs before. It didn't seem that different. And later his jaw clenched. He looked down, and then quietly, there was one girl, one night. She walked out of the service entrance around 2 a.m., no shoes, just holding them in her hands. Her makeup was smeared, but she wasn't crying. It was worse than crying. She looked hollow, like whatever had happened inside had drained her from the inside out. He stopped, looked at the floor. She didn't say anything, didn't look back, just disappeared into the street like she was afraid someone would call her back in. Ben didn't write that part down. His hand rested still on the page. He just closed his eyes, not in exhaustion, but in a kind of grim confirmation, because he'd heard enough by now to know this wasn't about luxury. This wasn't about exclusivity. It was about silence and the price extracted to keep it. The prosecution then brought out a series of printed documents, event planning emails, inventory lists, calendar reminders. Every detail from towels to candle brands, scripted greetings, even temperature settings. It painted a picture not just of wealth, but of control. Control over timing, over setting, over perception. One line in a memo read, "Everything must appear seamless. Comfort breeds compliance." Another, studio prep must follow emotional script. Ambiance is key. The court grew still again. The analyst returned to the stand briefly to verify the email trail. "Yes," she said. These were not promotional events. They were structured interactions. The same script over and over. That afternoon, an anonymous hotel staffer testified via video. Her voice was distorted, face blurred, but her words cut clean. They always requested rooms without windows, special blackout curtains, soundproofing. We weren't allowed to knock. What were you told? That the guests needed media discretion. But I've worked with actual celebrities before. This was different. They were nervous, not private nervous. Ben scribbled again, not media control, behavior control. He flipped through Jane's journal matching hotel names. She had described one by its carpet pattern, another by the soap scent, all matched. Then came the final moment of the day. The prosecution wheeled in a sealed display case. Inside a leather-bound book, real, physical. The logbook kept by Assistant T. They didn't open it, they didn't need to. The prosecutor simply said, "This book is not a diary, it's not a reflection, it is documentation. A day-by-day, moment-by-moment record. It is the system in ink." The courtroom didn't erupt, it inhaled. Ben sat still, eyes locked on the logbook. Outside, the sky was starting to darken, but inside the truth had never been clearer. When the court reconvened the next morning, there was a different kind of tension in the air. Not dread, not anticipation, but weight. A shared understanding that whatever was about to be said could not be unsaid. That silence had already been breached, and from here on out, everything was about what came next. Ben Chu had barely slept. He didn't need rest. He needed clarity, and clarity came in fragments, notes from Mia, photos recovered from storage, Jane's journal entries, and now T's logbook. Everything pointed in one direction, a structure that relied not on fear, but normalization. People had stopped questioning because everything looked clean. The morning witness was a former driver. His name wasn't listed on the docket. To the court, he was just another piece in the chain. But once he stepped onto the stand, broad-shouldered in a worn blazer that didn't quite fit, something shifted in the room. He didn't carry the nerves that most witnesses did. He wasn't polished or hesitant. He looked simply exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from work, but from remembering too much and saying too little for far too long. He was a contractor, not full-time staff, hired through a transportation company linked to one of the many shell firms the tech team had traced. His job, he explained, was straightforward airport pickups, discreet drop-offs, and silence. It was always solo rides, he said, no luggage, no companions, just a name and a time. That's what would show up on the order. The prosecutor leaned in. Which airports? LAX, he said. Van Nuys. Sometimes Burbank. Couple times out at that private terminal in Nevada. The one with no signage. It wasn't always the same girl, but the profile always similar. Young, nervous, dressed like they were going to a photo shoot or a party, but no smiles. He paused. Sometimes they cried, he added softer. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. Just stared out the window the whole ride like they weren't sure where they were going, or if they were supposed to want to go there. Were you told where to take them? The prosecutor asked. The driver nodded once. Always the same destination. Sometimes it was labeled Studio B in the GPS notes. Other times just the house. I never saw a number. No street sign. Just a gate that opened when I flashed the tag on my dashboard. Did you go inside? Number drivers weren't supposed to leave the car. There was always someone waiting. A man in a blazer or a woman with a clipboard. They didn't greet the guests. They just retrieved them. He said it like someone describing a lost package. The courtroom was quiet but not frozen. It was listening. The prosecutor flipped through a file. You mentioned once a guest ran. Tell us about that. The driver shifted in his seat, jaw tightening as the memory surfaced. It was late, maybe 11 p.m. I'd just pulled up to the secondary gate, one of the side entrances near the trees. The girl in the back seat had been quiet the whole drive. Wouldn't drink the water I offered. Wouldn't say her name. Just nodded when I asked if she was cold. He paused. When I opened her door, she didn't step out. She bolted. He nodded. No screaming, no panic, just movement. Like she'd been waiting for the exact moment someone let their guard down. What did you do? I stood still, he said. She didn't get far, maybe 15 feet toward a hedge. Then someone grabbed her. Not rough, just fast. They said something low I couldn't hear, but she stopped struggling. He exhaled. They walked her back in like nothing happened. And then one of the staff looked at me and said, "That doesn't go in your report." Did you report it anyway? No. His voice was steady now, but I remembered. I remember her face. I remember the way she looked back at me just once, like she thought maybe I'd say something. Or maybe like she already knew I wouldn't. A long silence settled across the courtroom, not out of disbelief but recognition. The kind of quiet that descends when everyone present understands they've crossed into a new territory. Past rumor, past speculation, into something that feels too coordinated to be accidental. Ben Chu didn't take notes during that testimony. He just stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, a muscle flickering near his temple. Because everything that had sounded like strategy before, playlists, protocols, ambiance, scripts, now had a face, and it was barefoot, running, silent. That afternoon, the lights dimmed ever so slightly in the courtroom. Not intentionally, not theatrically, but just enough for the projection screen to command full attention. The prosecution played a video. It wasn't dramatic, not in the traditional sense. There was no sound, no clear faces. It was blurred, time-stamped, and silent, but it was enough. It was surveillance footage taken from a fixed camera mounted near a loading dock, outside what records identified as a private estate. The angle was wide, capturing a stretch of concrete between two parked vehicles and a dim side entrance with a coded keypad. The video began without ceremony. An assistant wearing dark slacks and a light coat walked into frame, opening the side gate. A few seconds later, a young woman stepped in behind him. She was limping slightly. One hand clutched her shoes. Her posture was stiff, like every muscle had been working overtime, just to keep her upright. But it was her eyes that caught everyone's attention even through the blur. She kept looking over her shoulder. Not nervously, not fearfully, but like someone waiting for someone to stop it, for someone to say, "This is the wrong house," or "You don't have to go in." But no one did. She followed the assistant in disappearing through the door. The video ended there. No incident. No audio, no resolution, and yet the room felt heavier. Ben Chu watched the clip from the gallery without blinking. He'd seen worse, grislier, more explicit. But this, it was the quiet that hurt. The normalcy. The fact that everyone in the footage moved like this had happened 100 times before. When the screen went dark, Ben didn't speak. He just reached for his notepad and wrote a single word: repeat. Not shock, not proof. Repeat. Because it had happened before. Because it would have happened again. The prosecution moved on. The final exhibit of the day didn't look like much. A printed document, standard black and white ink, a memo about seating arrangements for a holiday party. It could have belonged to a catering company or an event planner or any Hollywood executive hosting a luxury event. But this one had notes in the margins, not festive notes, not meal preferences or RSVPs, initials, color assignments, cryptic phrases. One line read, "Studio B, prep early." Another DP green light confirmed, and a final one circled twice in pen music B2. Ambient low visibility, no flashes. Ben leaned forward slightly. He didn't need to ask what it meant. He'd seen the same phrases buried in testimony and texts in Mia's coded notes. This wasn't a party invitation. This was a coordination sheet, a logistics brief. Carefully disguised under the pretense of celebration, they weren't hosting an event. They were staging a performance. Jane's journal had one entry now displayed on a monitor beside the exhibit. "We were just props, lights, ambiance. If you broke the vibe, you disappeared." That line sat on the screen for a full 15 seconds, and no one moved. By evening, the sidewalk outside the courthouse had become a wall of bodies and lenses. Cameras stood in rows. Boom mics drifted overhead like fishing rods. But no one shouted questions. There were no aggressive reporters, no live interviews with defense attorneys or former managers. Just silence, flashing, stillness, waiting, because they all knew what was coming. It wasn't a verdict, not yet. It was a fracture. The moment when something glossy and unbothered finally split, revealing what had always been just beneath the surface. Ben didn't leave through the main exit. He stayed inside by the windows, watching the reflection of the media in the glass. He wasn't preparing for cross-examination or building an argument. He was tracking the shape of a story. A narrative so large it couldn't be told in one sitting or one trial or even one name. This wasn't about proving a single incident. This was about unraveling an entire system that had depended on being believable precisely because it looked ordinary. Because no one questioned the playlist, because no one noticed the robe, because the assistant always smiled. And now the illusion was coming apart, one blurry video, one scribbled memo, one line of journal ink at a time. The story wasn't finished, but it had stopped being hidden. It didn't end with a confession. It didn't explode into a dramatic finale. That's not how real systems fall. They erode, slowly, piece by piece. And by the final week of testimony, what was once a myth had become something far more fragile, a memory exposed to light. Ben Chu stood outside the courthouse steps, watching reporters gather not to speculate but to prepare. Every story filed, every update broadcast had the same undertone the illusion had cracked. There were still questions, still gaps, but the outline was no longer deniable. Inside the courtroom, there was a noticeable stillness. The kind that comes after a storm when the air feels too clean, too calm. It wasn't over, but the shape of the trial had shifted. This wasn't about a single claim anymore. It was about pattern, about design, about the way truth leaves fingerprints even in silence. The prosecution rested their case with precision. No theatrics. No final witness meant to shock. Just a final slide projected onto the courtroom screen, a single line from Jane's journal. He never raised his voice. He didn't have to. The House did the talking, and that was it. Then came the defense. Their strategy wasn't denial, it was dilution. They acknowledged certain events, certain parties, certain payments, but framed them as consensual, as misunderstood, as out of context. They called a former event coordinator who described luxury, not logistics, a security manager who claimed he never saw anything improper, a legal advisor who reminded the court that NDAs are common practice. But the jury didn't flinch, because they had heard Mia, because they had read Jane, because they had seen T's logbook page by page. And then, as if the air itself had been waiting, the final piece came not in the courtroom, but online. A leaked photograph, blurry, cropped, but recognizable. A table set for 3. Candles playlist card, and in the background a mirror that wasn't a mirror. One the prosecution had already shown in diagram form. Now it had a face. The image spread within minutes. By lunch, Studio B trended again. By Sunset Networks aired retrospectives. Ben didn't speak to reporters. He just walked. Around the block. Down an alley. Toward a bench where he sat alone with his notebook. On the first page he wrote, "The silence wasn't absence. It was design." And then he exhaled. When the jury returned, their verdict was still days away. But everyone in that courtroom already knew the narrative had changed. The man on trial was no longer just a figure of fame. He was part of a system, a carefully managed environment that thrived not by accident, but by architecture. In the final address, the lead prosecutor said this: "We are not here today to tell you what happened behind every closed door. We're here to show you how those doors were built, and who held the keys." Ben Chu watched from the second row, hands folded, eyes steady. The defense objected. The judge allowed it. The statement stood. That night the lights outside the courthouse didn't flicker. They burned steady. News anchors stood in rows. Analysts recapped testimony. Experts explained environmental manipulation. Even late-night shows dared to touch the story with caution, but with volume. And behind all of it, the pages from Jane's journal echoed like scripture. Not because they were poetic, but because they were real. One final entry was read aloud quietly in court. "If you're reading this, it means I got out. It doesn't mean I escaped. It just means I remembered." No one cried, no one clapped. They just listened. And when the court adjourned for the final time, Ben Chu stood in the hallway, closed his notebook and whispered, "It's not about whether people believe her. It's about the fact that they're listening." The trial would be studied for years, not just for what it uncovered, but for how long it was hidden in plain sight.